Hi everybody. In this next set of videos we're going to be discussing deontology, which as I mentioned in the videos on utilitarianism is one of the other more popular moral theories, and we're going to be focusing on Kantian deontology in particular. Immanuel Kant is kind of the grandfather of deontology, if you will. But before we get to Kant's moral philosophy in particular, in this video I'm just going to go over some preliminaries about deontology. So deon in Greek means duty. That's where we get the word duty from. So unlike utilitarians that are consequentialists, all deontologists would affirm this. All deontologists affirm the position that moral action is based on duty and is not based on consequences. So whether or not your action is right depends on whether or not there is a corresponding obligation or duty to perform that action. All right. Now, and deontologists have various reasons to criticize consequentialism of all kinds. So all deontologists, despite the kinds of disagreements that they're going to have with each other, all deontologists are non-consequentialists. So consequentialism, again, is the position that the consequences of our action solely determine whether or not that action is right or wrong. Deontologists are going to say, no, the consequences of our actions do not solely determine whether or not our actions are right or wrong. It's something other than the consequences which determine whether or not the action is right or wrong. Okay, so I'm going to give you quickly at least two different kinds of arguments for why consequentialism might fail. Okay, so here's kind of a Kantian argument. So Kant says that you and I are only morally responsible for what we can control. So he says that ought implies can. So if I am obligated to do something, if I ought to do something, that means that I have to be capable of doing it. So ought implies can. Now, if it's true that ought implies can, if it's true that if you are obligated to do something, that means it's within your power to do it. You have the capacity to do it. Logically, it follows that if you're incapable of doing something, then you can't be obligated to do it. So if it's true that if I'm obligated, then I'm capable, it's also true that if I'm incapable, then I'm not obligated. I can't possibly be obligated to do the impossible. I can't be morally responsible for something that is not within my control. So I am only morally responsible for what is within my control. However, but if consequentialism is true, then the morality of my action will depend upon things that are outside of my control. Or if consequentialism is true, I am sometimes morally responsible for things that are outside of my control. So sometimes I act with good intentions, I act with appropriate motivations, and unforeseen consequences result from my actions. Now, if you're a utilitarian who says that the actual consequences of an action determine whether that action is right or wrong, regardless of whether or not those consequences are expected or foreseen, even if it's true that at the time of your acting, you were not in a reasonable position to foresee or expect bad consequences, you're still morally on the hook as far as your action is concerned. Now, you're not morally on the hook as far as your moral character is concerned, remember. So if you're acting with good intentions, with proper motivations, that says a lot about you as an individual. You're a good person that did the wrong thing. But you're still morally on the hook for the bad action, for the wrong action. So you're a good person, but you did the wrong thing. Now, but if it's true that I'm only morally responsible for what I can control, and the consequences of actions are not always within my control, and consequentialists say that the consequences of an action solely determine whether or not the action is right or wrong, well, it follows from 1 and 2 that consequentialism must be false. So if you're going to say you're only morally responsible for what you can control, and it's also true that the consequences of your action are sometimes outside of your control, well, that means that the consequences of your action cannot solely determine whether your action is right or wrong. Now, but if every version of consequentialism fails, then obviously utilitarianism fails, since utilitarianism is a version of consequentialism. Now, a slightly different kind of argument that we could give is this, and it is that consequentialism recommends what we could call inconsistent moral action. So this is more of a pressing concern for act utilitarianism than it is for rule utilitarianism. But even rule utilitarians aren't necessarily going to mandate that the moral rules themselves be consistent. The moral rules themselves need to just be optimific. So theoretically, it seems that we could have optimific social rules which nevertheless are some sense inconsistent. So for example, if for some reason, let's just say for some reason, it would be true that if people with blue eyes were not allowed to vote, then the world would be a much better place. If it's true that a world where blue-eyed individuals are not allowed to vote, the world would be a much better place, then it would be an optimific social rule to not allow blue-eyed people to vote. But this seems to be a really arbitrary, discriminatory policy. You know, every blue-eyed person would, and me in particular, I would have something to say about that if we tried to pass a law saying, well, since you have blue eyes, you're not allowed to vote. Well, we don't have any good reason to think that being, you know, the color of your eyes says anything interesting about whether or not you're going to be an informed voter. But let's just say hypothetically that the world would be a better place. Well, on rule utilitarian grounds, even though this rule is somewhat arbitrary and discriminatory, it's nevertheless a good rule. Now, a deontologist would say, well, you're sort of violating the rights of individuals with blue eyes. You're treating them differently because of some feature that they possess that they largely have no control over. You're restricting their freedom. You're restricting their autonomy. You're not allowing blue-eyed individuals to have any say about how society is structured and the like. So on a purely consequentialist position, you can't fully articulate why this would be a bad policy per se, because obviously, for all we know, maybe implementing this policy would actually have better consequences than not, despite the fact that it involves things like violations of rights and autonomy and things like that. Okay, so on consequentialist grounds, particularly for act utilitarianism, since act utilitarians, again, cannot say that certain action types are right or wrong just in virtue of the kind of action that they are, sometimes one kind of action will be morally permitted based on the consequences. Other times that one and the same action will be morally impermissible based on the consequences. So name anything. We talked about torture in the previous videos. Well, is it wrong to torture? Well, it depends on the consequences. Is lying wrong? Well, it depends on the consequences. Is, infidelity wrong? Well, it depends on the consequences. Is breaking promises? So on and so on and so on and so on. So sometimes something like lying will be right or wrong depending upon the circumstance, but you won't really know until you've already done something. Now, so a Kantian is going to say, well, since the consequences of our actions are the kinds of things that we're not always privy to, why on earth would you ever make a moral decision based on something that you have no knowledge of? Or at least you don't really have any justified beliefs about, at least. So if the consequences of my action are something that I'm not always privy to, meaning that I can't always expect or foresee what's going to happen, and I'm going to judge actions on the basis of consequences, well, I'm judging actions on the basis of things that the individual had no ability to foresee or expect, and that does seem to be a problem. But the main issue here is that any action, lying, killing, stealing, torture, you name it, is either going to be right or wrong based solely on the consequences. So utilitarianism, at least act utilitarianism, does recommend inconsistent actions. Now, so a Kantian would say this: well, any moral theory which recommends inconsistent moral action is an inconsistent moral theory. So utilitarianism as a moral theory, consequentialism in general, is inconsistent with itself, because a consequentialist version of ethics will say, will give dictates of obligation of, yeah, sometimes you're obligated to lie, sometimes you're obligated to refrain from lying, sometimes you're obligated to steal, sometimes you're obligated to refrain from stealing. Well, how are you as an individual supposed to know what your obligation is or what your duty is in any variety of circumstances? So, our basic moral intuitions are, involve things like, in general, things like killing and stealing and assault are wrong in general. But if you're a consequentialist, you can't really say, well, in general. At least if you're an act utilitarian, you can't really say, well, yeah, in general, these things are wrong. So Kant in particular thinks that consequentialism provides us with no reasonable, consistent, or rational means of moral guidance here, and that's a particular reason why every version of consequentialism must fail. Okay, now, as far as deontology itself is concerned, largely comes in two camps. So the first camp is absolute deontology, or just Kantian deontology. So absolute deontologists are going to say that our perfect obligations are exceptionless. So Kant himself makes a distinction between perfect duties and imperfect duties. So the perfect ones, these are things that are always within your control, and since they're always within your control, they are exceptionless. So in particular, there are at least two here. So Kant thinks that it is always within our power to refrain from lying. It is also always within our power to treat other individuals justly and to treat other individuals with respect. So Kant would not say, this command follows, do not lie unless such and such is the case. Now, anytime you have a command like do not lie, and then you say unless such and such, you're automatically building exceptions and qualifications into the command. Now, our perfect obligations are not like that. It's not do not lie unless such and such. It's just do not lie. Stating it that way makes it exceptionless and irrevocable. It's not treat others justly unless you have to act unjustly to promote better consequences. No, it's just treat others justly. So since it's always within your power to refrain from lying, regardless of the circumstance and regardless of the consequences, and it's always within your power to treat others justly and to treat other human individuals with respect, you are always morally on the hook for every lie that you tell, and you're always morally on the hook for acting unjustly and failing to treat other individuals with respect. Now, the other camp would be some type of prima facie deontology. So the major disagreement that absolute deontologists and prima facie deontologists have is on whether or not we can have conflicting moral obligations. So Kant thinks that all of our perfect obligations are derived from reason, pure reason, and anything which is derived from reason cannot contradict or be in conflict with anything else that is derived from reason. So since all of our perfect obligations are derived from reason, and anything which is derived from reason is never going to conflict with itself, none of our perfect obligations can ever conflict. Now, the imperfect ones, which are going to be based on circumstance, so imperfect obligations will be qualified on the basis of whether or not something is actually within your power. So I clearly ought to promote other people's happiness to the extent that that is within my power, but a lot of times that's not within my power. So if my daughter wants her blankie and I'm in a position to know that getting her blankie will make her happy and it's within my power to give her her blankie, then I ought to give her her blankie, unless doing so would conflict with some other obligation that I have. So that's clearly within my power. But when my children are of dating age and they start, dating friends, getting romantically involved with friends and things like that, every single one of my children is going to get their hearts broken at least once. It's probably going to happen as they're dating individuals. And as their parent, I'm not going to have any power over that. So if my daughter comes home from school crying, because their romantic partner has broken up with them. The person they were dating has broken up with them, and my daughter says, I desire a mutual partnership, a romantic partnership with somebody who appreciates my skills and my talents and loves me despite my flaws and things like that. I'm gonna shrug my shoulders and say, I can't help you there, darling. I can't. It's not within my power to provide you with that. So I know being provided with this would really make you happy, but as your parent, I am not in a position to do this. So I don't have a standing obligation, to provide any one of my children with a trusting romantic partnership with a distinct individual. I can't do that. I wish I could, but I can't. I wish I could do something about your heartbreak. But aside from hugging you and letting you cry on my shoulder and getting you ice cream, this is outside of my power here. Now, so Kant will say, well, if obligations are perfect, they can't conflict. So since we have a perfect obligation to refrain from lying and a perfect obligation to be just, that means that veracity and justice will never conflict with each other. So if you think you need to be dishonest if you think you need to lie in order to guarantee what is just, Kant would probably just say you got the wrong idea about what justice is. So if you're planting evidence at the scene of a crime to get a conviction because you're saying, oh, this is what's needed in order for justice to be done. No. You're not only being blatantly dishonest, you are also being unjust in the process. If you're planting evidence at the scene of a crime, you are no longer being fair to the defendant in this case. You're no longer being fair to the accused in this case. Yeah, that would be grossly unjust for that reason. But prima facie deontologists will say, in practical circumstances, we will find ourselves having conflicting obligations. So, yeah, do we have a general obligation to refrain from lying? Yes. But we also have a general obligation to protect the innocent from harm. And prima facie deontologists will say that these two obligations are equally important. So it's not the case that your obligation to refrain from lying in principle is a stronger obligation than the obligation to protect the innocent from harm. These are equal obligations. So there's a general principle here. Non-maleficence, prevent harm and protect the innocent, protect individuals from harm and refrain from harming others. And the duty to veracity, to be honest in your word and in your behavior. These are equally important. So the principle of veracity and the principle of non-maleficence, these are equally important moral principles. But it's not going to be the case that in practical concrete circumstances that you're always going to be able to satisfy both. Sometimes, to protect other people from harm, you are going to have to be dishonest. Sometimes, to do what is best for another individual, you might need to lie to them. Not just deceive them, but, engage in full-blown lying to them. And cases where this actually comes up a lot of times is in cases of medical ethics and things like this. So do you really want to give the patient all the particular details of their diagnosis or prognosis if you have a reason to believe that by doing so you might be stressing them out? I mean, this is a pressing issue here. So what prima facie deontologists disagree with absolute deontologists is this. An absolute deontologist would say, okay, well, if two duties conflict in practice, then they conflict in principle. A prima facie deontologist is going to say, no, conflict in practice does not imply conflict in principle. So will the individual just thing sometimes conflict with the individual non-maleficent thing? Yes. So sometimes the individual just thing or the individual honest thing might conflict with the individual non-maleficent thing or the individual beneficent thing. But it doesn't follow from that justice and non-maleficence are in principle in conflict. So prima facie deontologists will say what explains the conflict is not the nature of the obligation itself, the general principle on which this obligation is based. What explains the conflict is the particular circumstance or What explains the conflict are the particular circumstances in which we are required to act. So prima facie deontologists will say what we have are general understanding of what our obligations are. We have obligation to promote well-being. We have an obligation to refrain from harming individuals. We have an obligation to be just. So this all makes sense in principle and in the abstract. However, what's much more difficult is determining what the just thing to do is in an individual set of circumstances, or what the beneficent or non-maleficent thing is in an individual set of circumstances. So that is what is difficult. And the moral landscape is much too complex for us to be able to have perfect knowledge of what our concrete actual obligations are simply on the basis of these kind of general moral principles. So we can't extrapolate from a general moral principle alone what our particular obligation is in a particular set of circumstances. The circumstances themselves are not going to solely determine what the right or wrong thing to do is. I mean, these general moral principles, we need to rationally consider them. However, the circumstances in which we act for a prima facie deontologist can make one kind of obligation overriding compared to a different obligation. So in these kinds of cases, it is the circumstances in which we are acting which explains the conflict, and not the principles that we are invoking, the general moral principles we are invoking in our moral decision making. Okay, now, so what the major disagreement comes down to is this. It is the difference between a moral principle or a moral rule being absolute and a moral principle or moral rule being universal. So a lot of times we will use the terms absolute and universal interchangeably, but they are different. So whether or not a moral principle or rule is universal just depends upon the number of cases in which it applies, or what we call the scope of the obligation, or of the obligation or rule, the principle or rule. So take justice. Well, when does justice matter? It seems it always matters. There is no circumstance in which justice is not important. It's always important. That means justice is universal. When is avoiding and preventing harm morally important and morally valuable? Well, it's always morally important. So in that sense, it's universal. Now, whether or not something is absolute, on the other hand, is a concern for whether or not it can permissibly be violated. So whether or not something is universal is just a matter of whether it applies in an individual circumstance. Whether or not something is absolute depends on whether it is exceptionless or irrevocable. Now, so Kant himself doesn't particularly have a good argument for this, but Kant is kind of inclined to think that the universality of a moral rule is derived from its absoluteness. So logically, if something is an absolute, it's also going to be universal. So logically, a moral absolute will apply in all circumstances, which means that it's going to be universal. So if something doesn't have any exceptions, then it obviously applies in all circumstances. But what's not abundantly clear is whether or not something applying in all circumstances means that it's absolute, that it's irrevocable, that it is exceptionless. So what prima facie deontologists say is that a lot of our obligations constitute universal non-absolutes. So in general, it is wrong to tell lies. But it doesn't follow from that that lying is always wrong, meaning that you are never morally permitted to tell a lie. So even if being truthful is morally important in every circumstance, lying might be permissible in individual sets of circumstances. So it's a universal. So lying clearly should not be the first option that you go to when you find yourself in a particularly sticky situation. No, lying is wrong in general. But even if lying is wrong in general, there might be circumstances where you are nevertheless cautiously permitted to lie. Now, but when it comes to our general obligations, this is a really important point. If a given course of action requires justification, that is an indication that it is in general wrong. So if a given course of action requires justification, then that is an indication that that course of action is in general wrong. So lying requires justification. So if lying did not require justification, then we could really tell lies anytime we want, willy-nilly. That seems to be incorrect. It seems that if I'm going to tell a lie, I need to cautiously and rationally be able to give an account of why lying would be justified in this set of circumstances. Well, why did you lie? Well, I lied because these kinds of circumstances or these kinds of conditions were in place. That seems rational. But the fact that lies have to be justified indicates that lying is wrong. Killing has to be justified. If killing did not require moral justification, then we could kill largely willy-nilly for any reason at any time. No, that's not correct. In order for killing to be permissible, killing has to be justified. That is an indication that in general, killing is wrong. So the prima facie deontologists will say, yes, we will have general sets of obligations. In general, it is true that killing is wrong. In general, it is true that lying is wrong. In general, it is true that harming other individuals is wrong. However, there might be mitigating circumstances which make it permissible nonetheless. Okay, so this is a general description of the two different theories, absolute deontology and prima facie deontology. And in the next videos, next set of videos, we will be talking about Kantian deontology in particular. So I'll see you then.